There are places, forgotten by the hurried pulse of the modern world, where the very air remembers. The Parker family farm, nestled deep in the untamed heart of rural Virginia, was one such place, its sprawling acreage holding more than just land and legacy. What ancient secrets, then, did the soil truly guard beneath its quiet surface? For generations, the Parker name had been synonymous with the quiet tenacity of the land itself. Their matriarch, Elara, carried the weight of this heritage not as a burden, but as an inherent part of her own bones, a memory shared only by the oldest timber of the main house and the silent, watchful gaze of the antique grandfather clock in the hall. Yet beneath the veneer of this deep-rooted permanence, a faint tremor had begun. It was nothing tangible, merely a shift in the quality of the light filtering through the dust motes in the parlor, a subtle hesitation in the morning breeze that usually swept through the ancient oaks. A familiar comfort was slowly, almost imperceptibly, being replaced by something else. The river, a constant companion to their lineage, flowed with a deceptive tranquility beyond the gnarled roots of the old cypress trees. Its currents, once a predictable rhythm of their days, now seemed to carry an unseen cargo, a silent premonition of disruption that Elara felt in the pit of her stomach, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a familiar comfort of autumn, was now tinged with an unfamiliar metallic note, faint but persistent, clinging to the air like a shroud. Each creak of the aging floorboards, each whisper of wind through the tall grass, seemed to carry a heavier weight, echoing not just sound, but an oppressive, growing silence. At times, particularly after dusk, the house would fall into a silence so profound it felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence, a living, breathing quiet that swallowed the natural hum of the world, leaving only the sound of one's own heartbeat, unnervingly loud in the sudden void. It was young Finn, Elara's grandson, who first noticed the anomaly with the grandfather clock. Not that it had stopped, for it had done so many times over its century of faithful ticking, but rather, it would suddenly jump forward, then rewind, its chimes echoing at impossible hours, a familiar rhythm shattered. This wasn't a mechanical failure, Finn insisted, his eyes wide with an intuition far beyond his years. There was a coldness about the clock face, he claimed, a subtle chill that radiated from the brass pendulum, growing more pronounced with each erratic chime, an invisible stain spreading through the otherwise warm hallway. Elara would dismiss it as the vagaries of an antique mechanism, a relic of a bygone era finally succumbing to time. Yet, a part of her, a part buried deep beneath generations of pragmatic denial, couldn't shake the image of the clock's hands, seeming to fight against an unseen force, a premonition that could still, perhaps, be unwound. The faded portrait of her great-great-grandfather, Nathaniel Parker, hung in the formal dining room, his eyes following her with an unnerving intensity she had always attributed to the angle of the light. Now, when the clock gave its false chime, a flicker of shadow would pass over his painted face, a subtle tightening of his lips, a silent acknowledgement of the shattered rhythm echoing through the hollow heart of their home. The family's routine, once a comforting tapestry of predictable moments, had begun to fray at the edges. Morning coffee, once a shared ritual of quiet reflection, now held an unspoken tension, a watchful pause between sips as if waiting for the next disturbance. It was a broken pattern in the fabric of their days, subtle but persistent. Even the ancient, gnarled oak that stood sentinel by the farmhouse, a living symbol of their lineage, seemed to bend more deeply in the twilight, its shadows stretching like skeletal fingers across the porch. Its familiar grandeur now carried a hint of threat, a dark silhouette against the fading light, suggesting a looming change. Finn's sleep had grown restless, his small body twitching in the depths of the night, haunted by whispers he couldn't quite recall upon waking. He spoke of a cold hand brushing his cheek, of voices like dry leaves scuttling across the floorboards of his dreams. His childlike innocence was being slowly corroded by something unseen, something reaching from the shadows. Alara found herself spending more time by the kitchen window, staring at the winding river that had always been a source of peace. Now, its surface, usually a shimmering mirror, seemed duller, the water itself appearing heavier, slower, as if reluctant to flow. A faint, almost imperceptible discoloration seemed to cling to its banks, a promise of something far more unsettling. The scent of the house itself was changing. The familiar aroma of aged wood and beeswax was subtly overlaid by something else, something metallic and sharp, like old pennies left out in the rain, a scent that hinted at an invisible wound slowly festering within the very structure of their home. It was a dense sensoriality of decay. The silence that would periodically descend upon the Parker farm was not the gentle quiet of rural life, but a predatory stillness, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very breath from the air. It was a silence loop, a recurring phenomenon that left Alara feeling isolated, profoundly alone, even with her family nearby. One evening, the porcelain doll, a family heirloom that sat primly on the parlor mantel, was found facing the wall. It was a small detail, easily dismissed as a child's mischief, yet Finn was asleep, and no one else had been in the room. This unsettling ambiguity hung in the air, a question mark on their perception of reality. The light in the old study, a room rarely used, had begun to flicker erratically, even when no one was near the switch. It would dim and brighten without cause, casting strange, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls, a progressive discomfort that Alara attributed to faulty wiring, but secretly feared was something more. The air often felt heavy, thick with an unspoken presence, sometimes a distant echo of children's laughter, faint and chilling, would seem to drift from the overgrown fields that once were tobacco plantations. A sound that was simultaneously familiar and deeply wrong, a poisoned callback to a forgotten past. Alara tried to rationalize each small deviation, each subtle disturbance, the draft from the old windows, the house settling, Finn's vivid imagination. Yet, the cumulative weight of these incidents pressed down upon her, a growing dread that refused to be silenced, a shadow of risk that lengthened with each passing day. She found herself checking the locks more often, though she knew the house itself offered little protection from the unseen force that seemed to be gathering within its very walls. The feeling of being watched, of not being alone, was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her waking hours. The familiar sanctuary was subtly transforming into a cage. The river's stillness deepened, its dark surface reflecting the bruised, twilight sky like an eye observing them without blinking. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, a persistent whisper on the wind. The Parker farm, once a bastion of legacy, was becoming something else entirely. The grandfather clock in the Parkers' main hall, a sentinel of generations, had always marked the slow passage of time with a rhythmic, reassuring thrum. But then, without warning, its polished brass pendulum began to falter, stuttering through its arc, before finally coming to a complete, unsettling halt, freezing the very moment. It was a broken pattern, a sudden, jarring silence where there should have been the soft tick of inherited minutes, a quiet rupture in the house's dependable pulse. Soon, the youngest Parker, Lily, no longer whispered of monsters in the dark, but cried out from visions that felt too real to be dreams. Each dawn found her trembling, recounting the same twisted, mud-choked figures and the choking scent of decay, a progressive discomfort seeping from her sleep into their waking world. Her small voice, once a bright chime, was now laced with a tremor that mirrored the unseen tremors beneath their feet. The parlor, a room once bathed in the soft glow of dusk, now harbored a stubborn shadow. The electric lamps, recently rewired, would flicker without cause, dimming until the very air seemed to thicken, absorbing light into a dense sensorial cloak of approaching night. It was as if the room itself was breathing, holding its breath in the face of an unseen presence, a pocket of absolute darkness that defied logic. Even old Silas, the neighbor from downriver, whose family had tilled the land for longer than any could remember, spoke of a peculiar stillness in the woods. He claimed the usual chirping of crickets had died, replaced by an unnerving, almost reverent hush, an unsettling ambiguity that hung in the humid air like a premonition. He remembered his grandmother whispering of times when the land itself held its tongue, waiting. Evelyn, the Parker matriarch, a woman who had always prided herself on her pragmatic spirit, found her memories no longer merely recalling facts, but replaying half-forgotten warnings. The hushed tones of her own grandmother, speaking of certain parts of the land that demanded their due, of the river's moods and the secrets buried deep, now echoed with a chilling clarity. It was a family exclusivity, a legacy of whispers she had always dismissed as folklore. The river itself, before its eventual bleeding, had begun its own quiet protest. Its waters, usually a murmuring slate gray, took on an unnatural stillness, reflecting the sky with a mirror-like precision that twisted familiar clouds into monstrous forms. A reversible omen, perhaps. A surface calm that hinted at an unseen turbulence churning beneath, an uneasy quietude before the storm. The house, their beloved home, began to breathe differently. Faint creaks sounded from the empty attic where no one walked. Doors that had always latched securely now stood ajar, seemingly opened by an invisible hand. The very silence of the house became its own sound, a deep, pervasive hum that vibrated through the floorboards, a silence loop that pressed in on them, making the air heavy and still. Lily's manifestations escalated from nightmares to waking terror. She would stare at unseen points in the empty room, her small fingers tracing patterns in the air that resembled forgotten symbols, muttering words in a cadence that was not her own, a threatening curiosity blooming from her innocent lips. Her eyes, usually so bright, held an ancient, unsettling knowing, a depth that defied her years. Evelyn, caught in the grip of this encroaching dread, fought to rationalize, to find scientific explanations for the inexplicable. Yet with each new anomaly, the echoes of her grandmother's warnings about the blood payment returned, a poisoned callback that gnawed at her resolve. She felt the weight of generations pressing down on her, the sins of the past now demanding their brutal public reckoning. The air itself in certain rooms began to carry a strange, earthy perfume, a scent like freshly turned soil and ancient dampness, clinging to the fabric of the furniture, a dense sensorial assault that could not be aired out. It was the smell of the land, but intensified, as if the earth itself was exhaling its buried secrets into their domestic space, a suffocating presence. Lily's recurring dreams now contained a chilling, specific detail, a spectral hand, skeletal and reaching, stretching from the riverbed toward a crumbling, unnamed structure. This progressive discomfort, this visual anchor in her terror, began to define the edges of their growing dread, a terrifying clue delivered nightly in the fragile landscape of a child's slumber. Evelyn found herself drawn to a long-forgotten family Bible, its brittle pages filled with faded pressed flowers and brittle, handwritten notes. There, tucked between scripture and birth dates, were cryptic entries about a great quiet that had descended upon the land generations ago, a time when the river had also changed its temperament. It was a family exclusivity, a forgotten history suddenly demanding to be heard. The silence that now clung to the Parker farmhouse was no longer the comforting hush of a rural evening. It was a profound, suffocating absence of sound, as if the very air itself had been drawn taut, waiting, listening. This oppressive silence loop was broken only by the sharp, unnatural cries of birds abandoning their nests in the trees surrounding the property. Old portraits adorning the walls, once merely faded likenesses of stoic ancestors, now seemed to hold a subtle, unsettling ambiguity. Their eyes, though painted, appeared to track movements, their expressions shifting imperceptibly from one glance to the next, betraying a knowing gaze that chilled the observer, blurring the line between canvas and consciousness. A fleeting physical manifestation, easily dismissed, yet impossible to forget. A shadow, impossibly deep, skittered across the kitchen floor when no one was looking, a rapid, almost liquid movement. Or perhaps it was just the flicker of dying light, a shadow of risk that whispered of things seen and unseen, a quickening of the house's malevolent heart. The taste in the air, a metallic tang on the tongue, coupled with the heavy, damp scent of decay, became a constant companion. It was a triple sensorial assault: the copper taste, the thick smell of decomposition, and the clammy feel of the air on their skin, a dense sensorial signature of the encroaching horror. A sound, faint at first, then more persistent, began to emanate from the walls of Lily's room at night. A low, guttural moan, like an animal in pain, or perhaps an ancient, forgotten lament, a threatening curiosity that burrowed into the core of their peace. It was a sound that shouldn't be, a vocalization from the very bones of the house. Their long-established morning routine, a comforting anchor in their lives, began to unravel. Breakfasts were cut short by Lily's sudden, inconsolable crying fits, or by the strange, inexplicable loss of power to key appliances, a broken pattern that chipped away at their sense of normalcy, leaving them adrift. The Parker family found their attempts to maintain a semblance of order increasingly futile, their quiet denials growing thin. Each new occurrence, each escalating sign, brought with it a deeper, progressive discomfort, a creeping realization that they were not merely experiencing isolated incidents, but rather an unfolding, inescapable narrative. The past, Evelyn now understood, was not merely infiltrating their present, it was consuming it. The whispers of the ancestors, the desperate pact made during the brutal final days of the Civil War, no longer felt like distant history. They were a living, breathing presence, a poisoned callback from the very soil they stood upon, demanding its horrific due. The house, once a bastion of peace, became a cage. The comforting familiarity of its walls now felt like the tightening grip of a hand, each floorboard and beam whispering secrets too terrible to name. The shadow of risk became their constant companion, a chill that seeped into their bones, promising an inevitable descent into the horror they had inherited. The quiet erosion of their world deepened, settling like dust over every surface. But it was Martha, the matriarch, whose spirit felt the grit most acutely. The river's crimson flow was a public testament to their private nightmare, a horrifying banner unfurling across their land, demanding an answer that no living Parker possessed. Her search, at first an aimless wander through forgotten rooms, became a desperate pilgrimage through the very architecture of their inheritance, driven by a threatening curiosity about the precise nature of the horror that had begun to claim them. She sought not clarity, but a whisper, a forgotten echo in the dust-choked corners of the sprawling estate, a family exclusivity to this particular strain of despair. It was in the oldest wing, rarely disturbed since her great-grandmother's time, where the air hung so still it seemed to hold its breath. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing broken shutters, illuminating a forgotten chest in the study's furthest recess, its lock a rusted grin. The chest yielded not treasure, but the brittle weight of generations of grief. Beneath layers of moth-eaten linens and dried flowers, she found it. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and fragile. The script, a spidery, precise hand belonging to Silas Parker, the same ancestor who had walked these lands when the smoke of war still choked the Virginia air. This unsettling ambiguity of its purpose, whether a record of life or a ledger of damnation, pulsed from its very being. Opening it was like unsealing a tomb. The faint scent of dried ink mingled with something metallic, something like old blood. Silas's early entries spoke of crop yields and livestock. Then abruptly, the tone shifted. The lines tightened. The ink grew darker, detailing the desperation of a land ravaged by conflict, the encroaching starvation, the imminent loss of everything. The shadow of risk, he wrote, was a hungry beast, gnawing at their very foundations, forcing choices no God-fearing man should ever contemplate. He spoke of a whisper carried on the wind, a promise given by something ancient, something that slumbered beneath the soil, older than the trees, older than the river itself. A pact, he called it, forged in the crucible of their greatest fear, promising prosperity, binding the land, and securing the Parker name for eternity, at a cost that even in his own cryptic words remained terrifyingly veiled. The dense sensoriality of his fear bled through the pages, chilling Martha's fingers as she traced the faded script. Meanwhile, young Lily, unbound by the stoic silence that had cursed her ancestors, became a living conduit to the encroaching darkness. Her night terrors evolved. She would awaken not screaming, but whispering, her voice a reedy echo of an older, colder cadence. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, would stare at a point beyond the veil, engaged in conversations with an unseen presence. The silence loop after these episodes was profound, a vacuum in which no light or sound dared to venture. One morning, the broken pattern of their routine became horrifyingly apparent. Lily emerged from her room with her small hands stained crimson, not from play, but from a viscous, sticky substance that seemed to seep from her very skin, mirroring the river's bleeding pulse. She simply presented her hands, a child offering a terrible gift, her gaze distant, fixed on something Martha couldn't perceive. The journal revealed more. Silas wrote of the offering, a periodic tithe of blood, not merely symbolic, but drawn from the lineage itself. A slow draining, a weakening, meant to appease the entity and renew the pact. He described symptoms, a creeping malaise, a fever that left its victims pale and listless, their vital force subtly siphoned away. The progressive discomfort Martha had observed in her own family, the unexplained fatigue, the fading vitality, now chillingly coalesced into a monstrous pattern. Lily, in her increasingly altered state, began to draw, Her crayons produced disturbing images of stick figures tethered by red lines to a colossal, unseen mass beneath the earth, and of faces contorted in silent agony, their eyes black voids. She drew the Parker farm, but its fields were not green. They were a vast, undulating crimson. These drawings were a reversible omen, both a warning and a potential map to the horror, a child's unfiltered translation of an ancient curse. One entry, scrawled in a moment of apparent desperation, spoke of a protective ritual, a countermeasure, requiring the sacrifice of the bound and the cleansing of the waters. But the lines blurred, fragmented, dissolving into frantic, incoherent scribbles. It was a poisoned callback, hinting at a solution, yet offering only further torment, a tantalizing glimpse of a cure woven into the fabric of the disease itself. The house itself seemed to draw breath, a living, suffering entity. That evening, as a storm gathered, the air grew thick with unspoken dread. The flickering light from the few remaining bulbs struggled against a profound darkness that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Then, in the dining room, where generations of Parkers had broken bread, a cold, wet handprint appeared on the polished surface of the antique table. It was distinct, undeniably real, yet no one had touched it. It shimmered with an unnatural phosphorescence before slowly, agonizingly, fading, leaving behind only an invisible residue of dread. If you made it this far without blowing out the candle, subscribe to the hidden horror. What comes next doesn't want to be seen alone. The partial climax had passed. The house had been touched, undeniably, physically, by the malevolent presence. But then, as quickly as it manifested, the terrifying phenomenon receded. The room grew warm again. The oppressive chill lifted, and the unsettling mark vanished without a trace, leaving the family alone, gasping in the ensuing silence. The clocks, which had stopped precisely at the moment of the handprint's appearance, began to tick again, their mechanical rhythm a cruel mockery of normalcy, promising respite, but delivering only the profound, aching knowledge that their sanctuary was breached, and the true horror had only just begun to awaken. The river, once a silent sentinel, was now an open, weeping wound across the land. Its crimson flow thickened, no longer just a stain, but a viscous, sluggish current that clung to the banks, leaving behind a residue that shimmered like dried blood in the sickly dawn light. A pallid, sweet metallic scent, once subtle, now hung heavy in the air, clinging to the very fabric of the Parker home. A dense sensoriality that promised more than just the end of a season. Eleanor, the matriarch, found her meticulous routine, once an anchor in the shifting currents of life, utterly shattered. Her mornings, once defined by the rhythmic clatter of breakfast dishes and the comforting hum of domestic tasks, now began with the chilling quiet of Lily's room, followed by the silent, frantic search for the child herself, a broken pattern that frayed the last threads of her composure. Lily, it seemed, had begun to wander in her waking hours, drawn by an invisible current. The child's deterioration was a slow, agonizing unraveling, a progressive discomfort that manifested in more than just the night terrors. Her skin was a translucent white, veins like thin blue rivers beneath the surface. Her eyes, once pools of innocent wonder, now held a disturbing depth, often fixed on empty corners of rooms, as if watching phantoms only she could perceive. Sometimes she would whisper, not in her own voice, but in a guttural, ancient cadence, words Eleanor could not comprehend, yet filled with a chilling, threatening curiosity that promised unspeakable knowledge. Eleanor had tried to rationalize. She had called doctors, specialists, even environmental agencies, describing the river, Lily's symptoms, the creeping decay of the farm. Each attempt was met with polite disbelief, baffled diagnoses, or a chilling silence on the other end of the line. The outside world, bound by its rigid logic, simply had no language for this creeping horror. It was a unique, isolated burden, a family exclusivity that no outsider could share or alleviate. One afternoon, Eleanor found Lily in the disused root cellar, a place typically locked and long forgotten, its entrance now mysteriously ajar. The air inside was a cloying mix of damp earth and something far older, a scent that tasted of ancient fear. Lily was sketching furiously on the dirt floor with a piece of charcoal, repeating a complex, swirling symbol Eleanor had seen etched into the oldest gravestone in their forgotten family plot, a shadow of risk that warned of forces beyond their comprehension. Lily stopped, turning her head slowly, her eyes wide, staring at a space beside Eleanor's ear. "He's here," she whispered, her own voice overlaid with an almost imperceptible, gravelly undertone, creating a silence loop that hummed with unseen presences. Eleanor, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, reached for Lily, pulling her from the chilling darkness. She bundled the child into the car, determined to break free, to flee this cursed place. But as she turned the key, the engine choked, sputtered, then died, a broken pattern to a simple act. She tried again and again, but the vehicle, usually reliable, remained stubbornly inert, a mechanical corpse on the gravel drive. A wave of profound despair washed over her. They were truly trapped. The old pendulum clock in the parlor, a Parker heirloom that had kept time for over a century, began to chime erratically, not with its usual sonorous bong, but with a discordant, broken toll, skipping numbers, sometimes chiming 13 times, sometimes only 2. It was a reversible omen, a perverse mimicry of time's passage, a false promise of return to normalcy, quickly snatched away, replaced by the relentless march towards an unknown end. It was during one such maddening chime that Thomas, Eleanor's elder son, found an antique locket clutched in Lily's small hand. It was not one of theirs, yet Lily clung to it with fierce possession. When pried open, it revealed a faded daguerreotype of a man with cold, piercing eyes, a severe face, and a chillingly familiar high forehead. It was Elias Parker, the original patriarch, the architect of their prosperity, and unknowingly, their curse. The locket hummed with a palpable cold, a poisoned callback to a forgotten sin, a tangible link to the ancestor whose presence now permeated their dying home. The house itself began to mimic Lily's decline. Walls wept with an inexplicable cold condensation, leaving trails like tears. The flickering light motif, once confined to a single bulb, now danced through every room, causing shadows to stretch and shrink with an unnerving, deliberate malice. One evening, the very air in the study dropped to an unnatural, biting cold, dense sensoriality that pierced even the thickest sweaters. Papers scattered across the desk flew upwards, suspended for a moment, then crashed to the floor, as if thrown by an unseen hand. From the corner, where an old rocking chair sat empty, came a faint, rhythmic creak, as if a weight had settled into its worn wood. The family tried to deny what they saw, to attribute the strange occurrences to drafts, old house quirks, or collective stress. Thomas, ever the pragmatic one, attempted to secure every window, board up the cellar door, even cut off the water from the river to the house. But the creaking from the rocking chair persisted, a broken pattern of domestic sound, each sway a subtle violation of their fragile peace. He would find doors he had locked, now ajar. Windows he had latched, now standing open to the chilling night air. The subtle disturbances morphed into something more direct, more invasive. The recurring motifs of failing clocks and stagnant water became literal. The old grandfather clock in the hall began to leak a thin, dark fluid from its base. Not water, but something viscous and foul-smelling. A progressive discomfort that seeped into the floorboards. An undeniable violation of their sanctuary. Lily would often be found standing before the dark stain, murmuring to it as if it were a living entity, her words now comprehensible, though chillingly so. "He waits," she'd whisper, her voice thin and reedy, yet somehow carrying the weight of centuries. "He needs his due." If you made it this far without blowing out the candle, subscribe to the hidden horror. What comes next doesn't want to be seen alone. The sense of being watched, once an unsettling ambiguity, became a palpable, heavy presence. Furniture shifted when no one was looking. Old portraits that once gazed impassively from the walls seemed to follow their movements with eyes that held a knowing, malicious glint. One particular portrait, that of Elias Parker, now exuded an unnerving aura, its painted eyes seeming to deepen, to draw them into their ancient sorrow and rage. It was a silent loop, the house itself breathing around them, contracting, no longer a shelter, but a cage. Eleanor started finding small, desiccated animal carcasses on the porch, often arranged in disturbing patterns. A crow with its wings splayed, a field mouse with its head twisted at an unnatural angle. This was no common predator's work. These were deliberate arrangements, a shadow of risk that hinted at a ritual, a warning, or perhaps an offering from the entity itself. The air around the house grew heavier, tasting of old earth and something acrid, a scent of corruption that stung the back of the throat. The children's voices, those faint, echoing sounds that had been a recurring motif in the house, now seemed to twist, morphing into distorted whispers that called out the family name, drawing them into a deeper despair. The Parker family, once bound by blood and land, now found themselves bound by an invisible, tightening noose, a family exclusivity to a horror that grew with each passing hour. They moved through their days in a state of heightened alert, every creak, every shadow, every fleeting scent a confirmation of the malevolent presence that shared their home. Their attempts to rationalize, to deny, had crumbled. The river's crimson flow was a constant, undeniable mirror to the bleeding life force within their walls. And as the dark presence of Elias Parker solidified, not as a ghost, but as a corrosive force emanating from the very foundations of the farm, they understood that this was not merely a haunting. This was an inheritance. The matriarch, Eleanor, had once believed the journals were merely the ramblings of a fading mind, a cruel echo of grief. Now, as the crimson river mirrored the throbbing veins on her own temples, the scattered notes coalesced into a single, horrifying tapestry. The names, the dates, the cryptic rituals, they were not metaphors for despair, but blueprints for a monstrous transaction. A progressive discomfort settled deep in her bones, realizing the truth had been there, waiting all along. The river, once a silent vein of the earth, no longer merely bled, it pulsed. Its surface roiled with a viscous metallic froth, the scent of stagnant water now overwhelmed by the iron tang of ancient blood and something far more putrid, a decay that felt personal. Its waters no longer just stained the banks. They began to seep, slow and insistent, into the very soil of the Parker land. an undeniable expansion of the horror. A dense sensoriality pressed in from all sides, the world outside becoming as sick as the one within. Lily, the youngest, had ceased her night terrors. Instead, she wandered the house in a waking trance, her eyes reflecting a knowledge far beyond her years, her small hands tracing patterns on the walls that matched symbols Eleanor had just unearthed in the oldest, most brittle journal. This chilling mimicry, a poisoned callback to her ancestors' suffering, confirmed that the child was not merely affected, but now a key, a vessel, perhaps even a gateway. The full gruesome terms of the pact were laid bare by the crumbling ink. Not just land, not just fortune, but life itself, generation by generation, offered to an entity that fed on sorrow and the unraveling of human spirit. A desperate ancestor, Abraham Parker, driven by fear of losing everything to the war's ravenous maw, had traded his lineage's future for the present's fleeting safety. What form did this entity take? What true price was yet to be exacted? A threatening curiosity gnawed at Eleanor, even as dread suffocated her. The house, once a fortress of quiet habit, began to breathe with a malevolent rhythm of its own. The old grandfather clock in the hall, silent for decades, now chimed at random, discordant intervals, its rusted gears grinding like teeth. Shadows deepened and shifted even in daylight, suggesting impossible angles and unseen forms. The comforting familiarity of home had curdled, a broken pattern that left the inhabitants adrift in their own decaying sanctuary. Outside, the natural world itself seemed to recoil. The songbirds, once abundant, were gone, their cheerful melodies replaced by an unnatural stillness in the air. The crickets, usually a vibrant symphony after dusk, were silent. Even the wind, when it stirred, carried no breath of life, only a dry, rattling whisper that seemed to echo from an empty tomb. An unsettling ambiguity clung to the deserted fields, the trees motionless as if holding their breath. Eleanor, desperate, knew she could not stand idly by as her family, her Lily, was consumed. The journal spoke of an obscure counter-ritual, a forgotten atonement, a desperate measure to sever the ties. It was dangerous, almost certainly futile, yet it was the only thread of hope. Every step she took towards its execution was a deliberate embrace of the unknown, a journey deeper into the abyss. The shadow of risk loomed large, a cold hand on her shoulder. She spent days and nights poring over the brittle pages, deciphering the archaic script, cross-referencing symbols and vague locations on the farm. The ritual demanded blood, not just human blood, but that of the land, distilled through generations, mingled with specific herbs grown only in the most forgotten corners of their inherited acreage. This act, so deeply rooted in their twisted family exclusivity, required elements only the Parker name could unearth. The entity's presence grew, no longer subtle. It was not a sound or a sight, but a profound, unyielding pressure, like a bell jar pressed down on the house. The silence within the walls became an oppressive, palpable thing, a vacuum that sucked the very breath from your lungs. It was a silence loop that resonated in the hollows of the bones, a silent scream that never ended, never allowed a moment's respite from the coming horror. The chosen location for the counter-ritual was the old, unused tobacco curing barn, its timbers warped and groaning, smelling of damp earth and ghost tobacco. Eleanor prepared the space, drawing intricate, pulsing symbols on the packed dirt floor with the thick, crimson mud from the river's edge. The air inside was thick, cloying, with the metallic tang of that blood-soaked soil, the acrid scent of ancient dust, and the unsettling sweetness of decay. A dense sensoriality made the very act of breathing a strain. As twilight bled into a bruised night, Eleanor led a reluctant, strangely compliant Lily to the barn. The child's eyes were wide, vacant, yet they seemed to follow unseen movements, tracking the entity's progress as it drew closer. The very air around them thrummed with a low, almost inaudible vibration, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to originate from the ground beneath their feet. The progressive discomfort of the approaching climax was nearly unbearable. Eleanor began the archaic chant, her voice trembling but resolute, as she drew a small amount of her own blood and mixed it with the river's crimson ooze in a rusted basin. As the first guttural syllables left her lips, the already dim light of the lantern flickered wildly, threatening to extinguish. Outside, the sky, which had been a uniform bruised purple, now seemed to tear, revealing jagged cracks of sickly yellow and violent green. A broken pattern tearing across the heavens, Lily, standing within the central symbol, began to shudder, not from cold, but as if an invisible current surged through her small body. Her mouth opened, not to scream, but to emit a low, vibrating hum, a sound that mirrored the growing presence within the barn, a disturbing echo of the entity's own voice. This twisted internal resonance was a poisoned callback to her earlier, unexplained symptoms, now terrifyingly clear in their purpose. Eleanor continued, her chant growing louder, more desperate, trying to force the words into the very fabric of the air, to bind the entity. The journal had warned of confrontation, of the entity's rage. What form would it take? Would it be a physical manifestation, a monstrous shape born of shadows and despair, or something far more insidious? A shattering of the mind, a consumption of the soul, a threatening curiosity spurred her on, even as her body screamed for her to flee. As the final guttural word left Eleanor's lips, the barn was plunged into an absolute, breathless darkness. The lantern shattered, its glass exploding inwards with a sound like splintering bone. A cold, immense weight descended, not just on the air, but on Eleanor's very being, pressing her to the earth. She heard Lily's breath hitch, a desperate gasp, and then a faint, wet thud. The ritual had been completed, the cycle challenged, and the price, Eleanor knew with chilling certainty, had been paid. The shadow of risk had become a crushing reality. Then, just as suddenly, a different silence settled. Not the oppressive thrumming presence from before, but a hollow, echoing stillness, as if something vast had just withdrawn, leaving behind an emptiness that reverberated in the newly dead air. This was a silence loop that was truly unnerving, a void where sound should have been, leaving only the frantic beating of Eleanor's own heart. When the moon finally pierced the torn roof of the barn, casting a sickly silver light, Eleanor scrambled towards Lily. The child lay on the floor, unmoving. Her small body was untouched, yet her eyes, wide and staring, were no longer her own. They reflected not the moonlight, but a deep, churning void, an ancient alien intelligence that stared through them with a terrible, absolute knowing. The price had not been Lily's life, not in the way Eleanor understood. An unsettling ambiguity now clouded the child's very essence. The entity had not been banished. It had merely shifted its vessel, choosing the purest, most innocent conduit to ensure its continued claim on the bloodline, on the land itself. The house was no longer merely haunted. It was inhabited, truly possessed, its foundations intertwined with the horrifying new reality of Lily. This intimate violation, a chilling manifestation of their family exclusivity, was a betrayal deeper than any physical harm. The river outside still flowed crimson, a thick, slow current carrying the promise of eternal staining. But now, as Eleanor looked back at the house, she saw that the blood-red seepage from the banks had reached the foundations, creeping up the weathered stone, painting the base of their home in a permanent, horrifying blush. The air inside the barn now held a faint, sweet smell, like rotten flowers and something ancient burning. A dense sensoriality clung to every surface. Eleanor knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that the cycle had not been broken. It had merely twisted, mutated, finding a new, more intimate path to its inevitable conclusion. The river might still bleed, the sky might still tear, but the true horror was now locked within, a living, breathing extension of the curse. A progressive discomfort, now permanent, settled over the Parker legacy. Lily, or what remained of her, sat up slowly, her head turning towards Eleanor with an unnerving, deliberate motion. A faint, knowing smile touched her lips, a smile that was not her own, but an echo of countless generations of despair. It was a poisoned callback to the innocent child, now a chilling caricature of her former self. What did it want now? What fresh torment would this new manifestation bring? The very air vibrated with unspoken threats, with a deeper, more profound darkness. A threatening curiosity now stalked every corner of the house. The light of the moon, streaming through the broken roof of the barn, seemed to dim, swallowed by the profound presence. The barn itself seemed to groan, its ancient timbers shifting as if in silent agony, unable to bear the weight of the insidious truth revealed within its walls. The house, distant, seemed to shimmer in the darkness, a broken pattern on the horizon, waiting. The silence that followed was absolute. The last hope had truly gone out. The air within the Parker home no longer merely hung heavy. It had become a dense, viscous thing, pressing against the lungs, coating the tongue with the taste of rust and forgotten earth. The last desperate plea, the futile attempt to sever the bloodline's connection, had only served to awaken the beast further, to stir the ancient soil into an insatiable hunger. Every shadow now seemed to breathe, every creak of the old timbers a groan of profound agony, not from the house, but from what it held. What remained of the Parker family moved through this suffocating quiet like ghosts, their steps hushed, their eyes wide with a shared, unspoken horror. The matriarch, her face a landscape of etched despair, clutched the faded journal, its revelations too late to save them, too damning to forget. The river outside pulsed with a sickening, deeper crimson, not merely coloring the water, but thickening it, turning it into a slow arterial flow, a morbid pulse beating beneath the very foundations of their ancestral terror. The house itself began to mimic the family's decay, not violently, but with a chilling, systemic surrender. Windows fogged from within, not with condensation, but with a fine, internal dust that never settled, obscuring the world. Floorboards, once sturdy beneath generations of footsteps, now crumbled silently at the edges, turning to grit underfoot. The light, which had merely flickered before, now died in whole rooms, plunging spaces into an impenetrable gloom that swallowed even the strongest lantern flame. They watched, powerless, as the youngest child, once the fragile vessel of the curse's awakening, began to fade. Not just in spirit, but in substance. Her laughter, once a rare, cherished sound, dissolved into faint echoes that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a progressive discomfort that suggested her essence was being absorbed, piece by piece, into the cursed structure. Her skin took on a translucent pallor, her breath grew shallow, and her eyes, once vibrant, became pools of ancient, knowing sorrow. The river, that weeping artery, was no longer just an omen. It was the manifestation of the family's eroding life force. Each drop of its viscous crimson, a tear shed not for the Parker family's tragedy, but for the payment finally being rendered for a debt too old to comprehend. It flowed with an unsettling ambiguity, both blood and water, life and death, an inescapable symbol of their inevitable end. Silence, once an occasional visitor, became the house's permanent resident, a thick, suffocating blanket that muted every sound. The grandfather clock in the hall, its pendulum long stilled, seemed to absorb all ambient noise, its silent face reflecting only the encroaching shadow. There were no more frantic whispers, no desperate plans, only the soft, collective sigh of resignation as another Parker felt the cold touch of the invisible drain. This silence loop was the sound of their blood being drawn, drop by unseen drop, into the earth. The routine of their days, once a fragile anchor against the encroaching madness, had long since shattered. There was no waking, no eating, no sleeping in any recognizable pattern. Time had become a broken pattern, a meaningless concept in a house where the past was devouring the present. They simply existed, waiting, witnessing the final irreversible act of the long-foretold erasure. Each Parker carried a unique memory of the house, a specific corner, a particular scent, a secret hiding place. Now those cherished fragments of family exclusivity began to fray, dissolving like old photographs left in the sun. They spoke of things they couldn't quite grasp, names that hovered on the edge of memory, faces that shimmered and faded, a terrifying internal mirroring of the fading light within their own eyes. The curse wasn't just claiming their lives, it was claiming their very essence. A faint, fleeting hope, a reversible omen, flickered when, for a single moment, the river outside seemed to lighten, its crimson hue thinning to a sickly pink. They stared, breath held, but it was merely a trick of the dying light, a cruel illusion before it deepened once more, a richer, more vibrant red, mocking their fleeting optimism. The land demanded its full portion, not a single drop less. The ancestral pact, revealed in the chilling script of the journals, was not merely about land, but about unending sustenance. The entity, not a demon as they imagined, but an ancient elemental force tied to the very soil, required the lifeblood of the Parker lineage to maintain its own power. A parasitic relationship born from a desperate man's bargain. The prosperity was never free. It was a poisoned callback, the price of every harvest, every generation, paid in the crimson flow of their very veins. The air grew colder still, carrying with it the scent of damp soil and something metallic, like old pennies. This dense sensoriality was the smell of the end, the earth calling them back, not to rest, but to be absorbed, to feed the silent hunger that had festered beneath their lives for so long. The light, already struggling, seemed to be actively pulled down, swallowed by the floorboards, consumed by the shadows that writhed in the corners. The full truth, the horrifying 70% of the answer they were promised, laid bare the terrifying simplicity of it all. The Parker family was not merely being cursed, they were being harvested. The river, the children, the silent collapses, all were symptoms of a slow, ritualistic draining. A final offering to the entity that owned their very ground. What came next was not just an end, but a transformation, a becoming one with the very earth they had clung to so desperately. If something in here moved what you don't name, subscribe to the hidden horror. The next story will find you first. Their limbs grew heavy, their thoughts clouded, not with fear, but with an immense weariness, a profound, progressive discomfort that settled deep in their bones. They saw faint, shimmering outlines of ancestors in the dying light, transparent figures reaching out, not in warning, but in silent invitation to join them in the collective dissolution. The curse wasn't a sudden, violent death, but a gradual, quiet fading, an erosion of being. The shadow of risk they had lived under for generations was now fully realized, their gamble on life lost. There was no escape, no hiding. The boundaries between flesh and earth blurred, and the finality settled upon them with the weight of centuries of unatoned sin. Their bodies, once distinct and individual, began to lose their definition, becoming porous, permeable. The whispers, those echoes of children's voices that had haunted them, finally coalesced into a single collective hum. It was the entity, not a monster of claw and tooth, but an ancient, formless hunger, its presence a cold, vast emptiness that began to fill the very spaces where the Parkers had been. An unsettling ambiguity replaced their terror, a numb acceptance of their ultimate fate. The clocks in the house, long since stopped, now seemed to wind down in reverse, their internal mechanisms grinding to a halt, then disappearing entirely. The silence loop completed itself, leaving behind only the sound of their own hearts, beating slower, fainter, until even that was swallowed by the encroaching quiet. The house, their once sacred refuge, became a mausoleum of their living demise. The external world, once a distant reprieve, now seemed to hold its breath. Birds ceased their songs, the wind died, and the sky above their property took on a bruised purple hue that deepened with each passing hour. A broken pattern, a final salute to the unraveling of a bloodline. The natural order bent to accommodate their horrifying, unnatural end. The Parker family, the last vestiges of a lineage built on betrayal and blood, became a cautionary tale whispered by the land itself. Their specific memory, their shared burden, their family exclusivity was now woven into the very fabric of the Virginia soil, their life force feeding the ancient hunger. They were not merely dead, they were absorbed, their identities becoming part of the cursed earth. There was no sudden collapse, no dramatic final gasp, only the slow, inevitable transition. The river, thick with the very essence of the Parkers, flowed onward, a testament to the debt finally paid. The final breath was not one of release, but of acceptance, a soft sigh carried away by the scent of damp earth and blood, a poisoned callback to the beginning. The house, once a fortress of their suffering, now stood utterly silent, its windows like vacant eyes. The old portraits on the walls, once imperceptibly shifting, now seemed to stare out with a chilling stillness. Their subjects' features blurring, dissolving into the canvas itself. The river, a grotesque mirror, reflected the bruised sky and the silent, hungry land. The river ran red. The earth claimed its due. The crimson river, now a constant, throbbing vein of dread outside their windows, pulsed with a rhythm that had become sickeningly familiar. It no longer merely bled. It seemed to leach the very color from the surrounding earth, leaving a pallid, ash-like decay in its wake. The matriarch, her face etched with a wisdom born of unspeakable terrors, watched its viscous flow, understanding finally that the initial prophecy in the ancient journals had not been a warning, but a prelude, an appetizer to the feast of sorrows yet to be consumed. The soft hum of the old grandfather clock in the hall, a comforting anchor through generations, now stuttered, its pendulum swinging erratically, sometimes reversing its motion for a terrifying beat before halting entirely. It was not just the mechanism that failed. It was as if time itself had grown weary of its purpose within these walls, twisting upon itself, defying the natural order it once kept. The youngest Parker, the conduit whose fragile mind had first cracked open the hidden horror, now moved through the house with a chilling grace, her eyes wide and unseeing, murmuring ancient words in a voice that was not her own. Was she a victim, or had she become something else entirely, a vessel for the very entity they sought to repel? The house, once a fortress of quiet legacy, began to weep. Not just the slow, steady drip of a leaky roof, but a pervasive dampness that seeped from the very stone, tasting of salt and old blood. What began as a mere chill in the air had escalated into a profound, bone-deep ache, a coldness that clung to their skin like a shroud, refusing to be shaken. Every shadow held a predatory quality. Every creak of the floorboards suggested a presence that stalked just out of sight, just beyond the edge of peripheral vision. Each breath felt like a gamble against an unseen, crushing weight, as if the air itself was thickening, growing heavy with the unspoken promise of suffocation. The silence returned, deeper, more oppressive than before, a suffocating blanket woven from unuttered screams and forgotten prayers. Then again. That silence, echoing itself into oblivion, became a sound in itself, a ringing, deafening void that swallowed light and hope, consuming all natural sound until only the thrum of their own frantic hearts remained. The air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and rust, the metallic tang of old blood rising from the floorboards, which now wept a low, guttural moan underfoot. The dim light from the last oil lamp, flickering wildly, painted grotesque, dancing figures on the walls, shadows that seemed to lengthen and contract with a malicious, hungry intent. The full horror of the pact, the final, gruesome claws, began to unfurl before them, not through revelation, but through an insidious understanding. What lay beyond the door of their denial, now slightly ajar, was not mercy, but a deeper question. How could one atone for a sin so profound it had become woven into the very fabric of their existence, demanding not just land, but lineage? Only a Parker, burdened by the inherited weight of this monstrous legacy, could understand the particular chill that ran through the very timbers of the house when the old music box, long broken and silent for decades, played a single broken note, a lullaby of impending doom. It was a melody only they were meant to hear, a final call to surrender. Small, inexplicable bruises began to bloom on their skin, like dark petals unfurling, appearing without impact, migrating across their bodies with a slow, deliberate purpose, a visible sign etched onto their flesh that the curse was not merely external, but had begun to draw their lifeblood. Yet for a fleeting moment, one might imagine these marks fading, a reversible omen, but cruel deception. The static on the radio, once an irritating disturbance, now became a wall, impenetrable and absolute. No voices pierced its white noise. No news of the outside world reached them, just a continuous grinding hiss that echoed the sound of the unseen river drawing its final bloody breath. The world outside had faded, just as the old maps had ceased to show their forgotten pocket of Virginia, erased by an entity that claimed its own. The youngest Parker ceased to sleep. her small body twitching with unholy energy through the long, dark hours. She spoke only to the empty corners of rooms, her whispers growing clearer, distinct, recounting conversations that predated her birth, revealing names and places long buried, a broken pattern of childhood innocence replaced by ancient, chilling wisdom. The eyes in the antique portraits, once fixed and stoic, now seemed to follow them, not with a judging gaze, but with an unsettling, sorrowful pity. Had the faces of their ancestors always held that hint of desperation, that silent plea for absolution? Or was it merely the flickering candlelight that lent them such a transient, living horror? The air within the house grew impossibly heavy, the pressure building in their chests until each breath was a shallow, painful gasp. What began as a mere tightness around the heart had escalated into a profound, suffocating ache, a slow, deliberate drowning in the very air they tried to breathe, a final extraction of life from their lungs. From the depths of the river, a low, guttural thrum now resonated, not just a sound carried on the wind, but a vibration that pulsed through the very foundations of the house, through the soles of their feet, a heartbeat growing stronger, more voracious. Each moment felt like a gamble against an unseen, crushing weight, as if the earth itself was preparing to collapse in upon them. The silence in their minds, once a fleeting respite, now became a permanent resident, deafening and absolute. No rational thought could penetrate the dread. No memory could offer comfort. Then again, that silence, echoing itself into oblivion, became a void, swallowing consciousness, preparing them for an emptiness beyond thought or feeling. The scent of decay, once subtle, now permeated everything, a sickly sweet odor of wilting flowers and stagnant water, clinging to their clothes, invading their very skin. The floorboards, now slick with an unnatural moisture, squelched underfoot, and the light, what little remained, seemed to curdle in the air, transforming the familiar into something grotesque and utterly alien. They understood, with a chilling clarity that left no room for hope, that the debt was not merely for land or fortune, but for the very essence of life itself, endlessly extracted, generation after generation. What lay beyond this final payment, this ultimate emptying, was not extinction, but a terrifying redefinition of their existence, a servitude beyond death, far worse than any end they could conceive. Only a Parker would feel the final cold kiss of resignation settle upon their shoulders, the weight of centuries of doomed lineage pressing down. The faint echo of children's laughter, once a phantom comfort, now seemed to mock them, a cruel memory of a life not truly lived, a future forever stolen by the sins of the distant past, a secret shared only by their cursed blood. The stagnant air, once thick with the scent of damp earth, now shimmered with an almost visible distortion, like heat rising from a forgotten grave, twisting the very perception of reality around them. It was a sign that the boundaries were dissolving, yet for a fleeting, desperate second, one might imagine the air clearing, the mirage dissipating, a cruel trick of the failing light. The river's crimson flow, a vibrant, terrifying artery outside, now mirrored the life draining from their own veins. It was the ultimate payment, the ancient pact fully enacted. The prosperity ensured by that desperate ancestor, the land protected, now came at the cost of their very being, a legacy of blood drawn, just as the dark entity had demanded in those brutal final days of the war, a silent, unspeakable exchange. The river, once a silent witness to generations of lives, had become a pulsating vein of despair. Its crimson flow thickened, not with the simple hue of iron-rich earth, but with an oily, viscous sheen that clung to the banks. leaving behind a morbid residue. The air, heavy with the scent of damp soil and ancient decay, now carried a metallic tang, like old blood mixed with the bitter tang of dying leaves. Every ripple was a slow, sickening breath drawn from the very heart of the land, exhaling the final moments of a lineage. This was not a flood. It was an absorption, a consumption of light and life. The last of the Parker line, those who remained within the decaying walls of the farmhouse, felt it first as a chill that settled deep in their bones, a coldness that no hearth fire could banish. Then came the exhaustion, a weariness that transcended sleep, pulling them into a waking stupor where their limbs felt like lead and their thoughts, once clear as spring water, became muddied with an indistinct dread. Their voices, when they tried to speak, were thin and reedy, as if their very breath was being siphoned away, leaving only the echo of what they once were. In the parlor, beneath the cobwebbed chandelier, the portrait of Elias Parker, the patriarch whose desperate pact had set this nightmare in motion, seemed to weep. Not with tears, but with thin, dark rivulets that traced new, grotesque paths down the aged canvas, merging with the existing cracks. The paint itself, once a faded representation of a man, now appeared to writhe, the lines of his stern face shifting, subtly but unmistakably, into something inhuman, something that stared with eyes that were no longer painted, but seemed to hold a vast, unblinking hunger. What could possibly be left to take from them after all this? Was it merely the final drop of blood, the last whisper of a heartbeat, or something far more insidious? The entity, rooted to the land by a debt of blood and fear, seemed to crave not just their vitality, but the very essence of their memory, the footprint of their existence. It was a hunger for erasure, a desire to leave no trace of the transgression, no echo of the price paid. The silence that had begun as an omen now settled like a shroud, suffocating. The house, once filled with the creak of floorboards, the hum of mundane life, the occasional hushed conversation, became a tomb. No clock ticked, for they had long since stopped. No distant animal cry pierced the stillness. Even the wind, when it swept through the broken panes, seemed to hold its breath, unwilling to disturb the profound, final quiet that preceded absolute void. Little Lily, whose small hands had once traced the faded patterns on the parlor rug, was now a specter, her form translucent in the dim light that pierced the gloom. She drifted through the rooms, her bare feet making no sound, her eyes wide and unseeing, fixed on a horizon that only she perceived. She would stop by the old rocking cradle, where generations of Parkers had been soothed, and hum a tune of profound sorrow, a melody unknown to the living, yet instantly recognizable as the dirge of their own dissolution. Was it truly Lily who hummed, or merely the fragile echo of the entity's satisfaction, resonating through a vessel worn thin by sorrow and consumption? Her small pale lips moved, but the words that sometimes formed were not hers. Ancient phrases in a forgotten tongue, speaking of binding and forfeiture, of earth and blood, of a bargain that could never be undone. Her small hands, once so warm, felt colder than the deepest winter grave. The morning coffee, a small, comforting ritual that had marked the beginning of every day for a century, ceased to be brewed. There was no one left with the strength to grind the beans, to boil the water, to hold the mug. The rusted coffee pot sat cold and empty on the stove, a silent monument to a routine that had been broken, not by choice or habit, but by the insidious draining of life itself, leaving no energy for the simple acts that define existence. The shadow of risk was no longer a creeping dread, but an undeniable crushing weight. It had absorbed the air, consumed the light, and now pressed in from every direction, leaving no space for breath, no corner for escape. The walls of the old farmhouse seemed to draw closer, their timbers groaning under an unseen pressure, not of structural decay, but of an immense, malevolent presence that sought to flatten and erase. Every small sign, every whispered warning from the long-dead generations had been a reversible omen, a chance for a different path had they truly understood its language. But now, the irreversible had arrived, a wave of finality that swept over them, sealing their fate. The faint glimmer of hope, like a distant lighthouse beam, had flickered and died, leaving them adrift in a sea of crimson darkness, utterly lost to the currents of history and horror. The last of the Parker blood, thin and cold, sank into the thirsty earth. The portrait gazed, and the river flowed on.